Thank you. I'll start by just telling you a little bit about myself. Like Charles said, I work at Waterloo Village. And just by a show of hands, anyone ever been to Waterloo Village? Okay. And one more time, I'm going to make you participate. How many of you know about the Morris Canal? Okay. Because it did come right here to Jersey City. Okay. So we're connected, right, through that canal system. And I've been actively also working on the Morris Canal Greenway, the trail that we're trying to put together. So soon I'll be able to walk here for the next presentation, right? I have to leave a few days early, but okay, so Waterloo's a great place. We do lots of field trips. We're open on weekends in the spring, summer, and into the fall, the end of September. We do lots of different programs. If you want to learn more about Waterloo, just check us out on Facebook. It's Waterloo Village Historic Site. And that's all I'm going to say about that. And we're going to move on to one of my favorite topics. Am I speaking loud enough for you in the back? Yes. Yes. Okay. I was a cheerleader for a long time, so I usually can handle it. Okay. So I started to really develop a passion for learning about the Native Americans when I was in the 4th grade. And in the 4th grade, I had a New Jersey project. If there's any teachers in the room, you've probably remember the New Jersey project. And I waited until the weekend before it was due to tell my parents that I had this huge project. I hadn't even chosen a topic. And my mom, who was usually the one that, sat at the table with us and helped us through with the homework in the afternoon, she was so angry. And so my dad stepped in, and he just said, well, what do you like learning about in social studies? And I said, well, I really like learning about the Lenape. And at that time, we used to say the Lenape Indians. That's how we said it. And I said, that's what I like learning about. And so he said, well, let's do a project on that. So I wrote the one-page paper, it was only 4th grade, and we together made an entire village out of felt and pipe cleaners and people and little clothing and a river running through the village and wigwams and the whole thing. And that really, so a 4th grade project started what became a lifelong interest of mine. And I went to college for history and ended up with the dream job, where not only do I get to talk about the Morris Canal, early New Jersey, early America, but I actually get to talk about Native Americans, specifically the Lenape, same group that I did that project on all those years ago. So, that being said, this is a beautiful photo taken from the bridge. At Waterloo, we have a recreated Lenape village. We have about 15,000 school kids that visit every year, and they learn all about how the people were able to live as part of the environment in a very sustainable way for a very long time. And one of the things we talk about first is, what location? Where would they want to settle? Someplace near the water, right? It was a lot cleaner. We also visit this place first. How do we know what we know? A lot of it comes from archaeology, okay? I'm not an archaeologist. I'm a historian. But we do have, any archaeologists in the room? All right, great. So we have a simulated archaeological site, and basically it covers the basics. There's always an exception to the rule, but the lower down you go, the more likely the older the artifact or the eco-fact is. So we start there with, how do we know what we know? That, and also some personal communication. So if you go way back, the Paleo-Indian period ended about 12,000 years ago. And I was told I only have 40 minutes. So we're going to graze over 12,000 years ago and just kind of look at, what was life like? Okay, there was a really high infant mortality rate. They were only going to be living about 30 to 35 years. Following the food, animals were bigger. Things like giant beaver, mastodon, elk, everything was bigger, everything was colder. They were eating plants. different seeds and plants were available. They had a knowledge of plants. When the climate started to change, it went from tundra to forest, and with the changing climate and the changing animals, of course, the people adapted as well. So this is the period here that I find most interesting. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And if you look at the map, the Lenape people were living all over the state of New Jersey. They were living in parts of New York and Pennsylvania and Delaware, but basically the entire state of New Jersey. And there are some documented village sites. There are also a lot of sites that you may come across where there's maybe there were making projectile points there, or maybe it was a place where they were, had a fishing camp or some other sort of camp. So this was an interesting time for me. We had a group. This was the chief and member of his tribal council, and they came from Canada. They were part of the Munsee, Delaware Indian Nation from Canada, and they trace their heritage to be from the northern part of New Jersey, and they were there for the dedication of that village site that we were just looking at that interpretive plaque for. They brought gifts, which I thought was so sweet, and I do tours of this recreated Native American village for all kinds of people. Doing a tour for the chief, so talk about nervous, but actually what it did was it gave me, at the end, it gave me a lot of confidence, because he and his tribal council were so grateful and thankful. They were very happy that there were people who were interested enough in the way that the people once lived to come out and spend a few hours learning about it. So he wanted me to personally thank everyone who is interested in learning about the Lenape people. And the word for thank you in Lenape is wanishi. Wanishi. And let you all know that in his heart, the Lenape people, they felt they were part of the environment, not masters of the environment. So just keep that sort of frame of mind as we go through the rest of the presentation. Nature's bounty, so many things were available for food, and one of the things that most people don't know is you could survive for a real long time on cattails. They're the supermarket of the swamp. Almost any part of that plant is edible. You can eat the shoots. They're much more tender in the spring, and they actually taste like celery. I've tried them. The roots are sort of, the tuber root, it's sort of like a potato. You can cook it the same way you would cook any kind of a potato. The top is edible. So many different berries, raspberries, acorns. We know that the Lenape people were eating all different kinds of nuts, several different kinds of acorns. And I was an outdoor girl. Big surprise, right? I work for the State Park Service now. But I was a big outdoor girl, and I did try an acorn when I was a kid. Anyone here ever actually put an acorn in your mouth? Terrible, right? It's terrible. So you say, how could they have eaten acorns? How is that even possible? Well, there was a recipe, okay? First they soaked them for a long time in a mixture of basically ash water, a lye to leach out the bitterness and the tannins. And then they were dried, and then they were ground up, and they were baked into breads, and they were cooked into soups and stews. So they weren't eaten raw off the ground. This is a picture of one of our exhibits at Waterloo. And this is Winnacungue. Winnacungue is the name of our Lenape village, and Winnacungue means place of sassafras. So basically, anytime you hear a word with kung in it, or kong, that's a place. So you want to find out what the other part of the word means. So Winna in Lenape is sassafras. So Place of Sassafras is the name of our village. There are lots of sassafras trees growing there if you're not real sure what sassafras is. And this is our interpretive garden that we fight with the local animals every year to pull off. It usually does really well in the spring and through the summer, and the fall is when it gets real tense because the deer want in and the bears want in, but the kids are coming back. You know, they're coming back the first week in October. So right now, I would really like to employ one of my staff to be the guardian of the garden. So far, I guess I don't pay them enough, I don't know, but so far nobody will take the job. But in a Lenape village, the guardian of the garden was a child, sometimes an elder, which, by the way, an elder was anyone over the age of 35. So that's me included. And that was a shift work, right? Somebody had to watch the garden. It wasn't like today. We grow gardens. If the animals come in and eat it or the weather turns bad, we can just go to the store and buy more. That wasn't an option. So someone was always watching the garden. Little girls would throw rocks. Little boys would have their little weapons and tools that they had been working on, bows and arrows, and you know, they would keep the animals away. Now, one more thing I wanted to say about the garden. I'm not sure if, I know some of you are in the back and you may not have the best view, but the gardening was primarily the job of the women. The men would clear an area by chopping down trees and helping burn, but the women did most of the gardening, and they did it with tools that they made out of things like sticks and antlers. A deer antler attached to the end of a stick works like a rake. They used bones. They used, here's a little bone that I have. This is actually a jawbone from a deer. And this was a great bone. This was a great tool for using after you harvested the corn and dried it in order to get it off the cob, because you know it really starts to get to your thumbs after a while when you're trying to knock that dry corn off. But this was just perfect for shucking that corn. So the gardens were primarily the job of the women, and they planted the gardens in a really great way. They did it in a mound of soil. They would plant things like corn and beans and squash in the same mound. What one plant was taking out nitrates and nutrients, another one was putting back in, so that it was sort of a self-fertilizing garden. And it also, when the corn got to be about knee-high, it was time to plant the beans. The beans would start to grow up and wrap themselves around the corn stalk. So they had this great method for growing gardens, and we do it. We're not as good as they are, but you know, it's something to see. This is another picture of it. So you can see our corn stalks coming up. You can see our squash plants that we have around in the same mounds. And we try to, if you come to visit, we try to make a lot of our exhibits hands-on, interactive. So these are actually mortars and pestles. Some of you might have a mortar and pestle on your kitchen counter at home for grinding up spices, right? Maybe a little ceramic one or a little metal one. But we have them made out of tree logs and hollowed out in the same way with fire, and also the pestles made out of branches. And so you'll get an opportunity to actually grind up some acorns or some dried corn if you do come and visit us. Now, we all have cell phones, and I write everything down on my cell phone calendar, right? What time I had to be here, what time I had to leave my house to get here on time. You know, we used to rely so much on a clock, and now we're relying on reminders, you know, just little beep, 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 beep. So, I mean, think back to a time when not only wasn't there a clock or a reminder, but there wasn't a calendar with dates to follow. So they were following a moon, basically a 13-month moon year. And how do you know when it's time to plant? So for a lot of us, we think, you know, oh, after Mother's Day, you probably won't get any more frost. So you look on a calendar, you look for the month of May, you look for Mother's Day, and you plant after that. Usually pretty safe after Mother's Day. They were looking at signs in nature. So when the dogwood tree is in bloom, And that varies because I've been watching it for 8 years. We have a dogwood tree. And sometimes that's in April. Sometimes it's in May. Every season, every year is different, right? Every season's different, every cycle is different. But once that dogwood is in bloom, it's safe to plant your corn. This is just a picture of one of our longhouses that we have. And this is the edge of our garden here, and we've got some grasses, some long grasses that are used for weaving mats. Yeah?
How many people would live in a longhouse?
So they're different sizes. There are longhouses and there are wigwams that are sort of a rounded shape. But generally speaking, in one of the Lenape longhouses, about 25 people could fit in them. And they were usually all members of the same family. They were a matrilineal society, so there was, a grandma or someone in there, and it was mostly, her family that was going to be living in there. But about 25 people, pretty crowded. They didn't have as many electronics as we did, though, so didn't have to worry about being able to see what's hanging on the wall. So this was very similar to the picture in the beginning. Living near the water was extremely important. How they got out onto the water, a dugout canoe. You may have seen canoes made out of things like birch bark. That's done by groups that were much further north than we are because the birch trees just don't really get big enough here. You can make little baskets and bowls out of birch bark here, but to make a canoe, you need to go further north where the birch trees get bigger. So here they used things like the tulip tree, which is basically a poplar. It grows very straight and tall. It's a very light wood, and they would burn the wood at the bottom, burn the tree at the bottom in order to get it to fall over for chopping it down, because just taking one of those stone axes and whacking it against a live tree, it's going to take a really long time, right? So they would actually burn the wood first and then chip and chop away at it, get the tree to fall over, and shape out a canoe the same way by burning along the side of the tree trunk and then using different tools to hollow it out. Now, some of the canoes were large enough to hold 20 people. Really large trees, and just an immense amount of work. And really, other than their own 2 feet, that was the only other mode of transportation they had, was dugout canoe. They weren't riding on horses, so that was how they got out into the water to do their fishing. And this is one of our fun exhibits that we have, a little tiny canoe with a boy fishing out there. And again, watching signs of nature. When the shad bush blooms, and there's a beautiful book. The author's name is escaping me right now, but I'll tell you guys at the end. I'll look it up. There's a beautiful children's book called When the Shad Bush Blooms, and basically, again, when this bush was blooming, that's when the shad were running up the river. That's when it was time for that springtime gathering. So fishing in the spring was a time to obviously catch as many fish as you could while the getting was good, but it was also a social event. So coming off a long winter, being in the longhouse, storytelling, doing other things to keep the kids quiet, getting together in the spring at the fishing camps was, a social time. It might be a time for meeting a significant other, and it was a lot of fun. It was sort of like the beginning of the season, the kickoff. These are just some of the different fish that go up the river to spawn, and then others, like the eel, go back out. You don't hear a lot about eels anymore, but they were such a common food. Even when you go back to colonial and even 100 years after colonial time, they were still eating eels. But basically, when the rivers were dammed up for different reasons, whether it was the Morris Canal, right? They're creating slack water areas for the boats to go by. That stopped a lot of the fish migrating back and forth. Okay, we're getting a little dark there, I don't know why, but so freshwater mussels and crayfish were another big food source. Now, freshwater mussels, believe it or not, they have the garbage pits from freshwater mussels have given people lots of information about the Lenape people. So they ate a lot of them. They weren't too hard to catch, right? You just grab them as you're walking along. But you have to get rid of the shells somewhere because they're sharp, they're gonna start to smell. So they were in these big piles, these big, garbage pits. Mittens, shell mittens, very good. I try to use,
Teach people new words.
Yes, I can teach people new words. A shell midden. And so also in those shell middens would end up being some garbage. And if you think about, if someone was to go through your garbage today, right, they would learn all kinds of things about you. And so finding some sort of a garbage pit is actually pretty exciting because there are all kinds of things you can find out about the people just from rooting through their garbage. This is just a little area where we're talking about smoking fish. So fire was not only for warmth and cooking, also for smoking things and drying things. And it's so important that we have all of these little pump drills here that we also have available. I have an example of one. If anyone wants to give it a try after the presentation, there are several different ways to start a fire without matches. And you've probably seen on television at least one time in your life somebody taking a stick and trying to spin it as fast as they can between their two hands, right? And basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to get this stick, this center pole or drill, to spin as fast as possible, create enough friction to create enough heat to get a spark to start a fire. So a bow drill, if you're familiar with a bow drill, makes it a little bit easier, right? Because you're using a tool instead of both hands. Now you can just use one hand. And this is a pump drill. In a pump drill, you use both hands, you twist this up, and they came in all different sizes. And then you're just going up and down, and you're trying to get this center piece to spin as quickly as possible. So this will be here if anybody wants to try it. It's a little like riding a bicycle. Once you get it, you've got it, but it can be a little tricky in the beginning. And these would, of course, be in all different sizes. They were used for drilling holes, really small pump drills. Could drill holes through shell to make jewelry and bone. Larger pump drills were used for drilling larger holes and also creating enough friction to start a fire. These are just some of the different rocks. Of course, projectile points are one of the most commonly found artifacts, projectile points and net sinkers. Basically anything made out of stone is going to last for a long time. Trees. Now, my parents, they had a tree cut down because it was dropping too much stuff on their deck, was what they kept saying. Every time we come outside, the deck is a mess. So they cut down a beautiful tree because it was dropping too much stuff on their deck. And I know a lot of people who have trees cut out of their yard. Beech nuts, black walnuts. They don't want these things in the yard because people are tripping on them, or they got one stuck in their toes when they were walking barefoot. This is all food. This is all food. I mean, we walk past these and go to the store and buy European walnuts and eat them. These are 100% edible. They have to be processed. You can't just crack it open right there on the ground and eat them. But this is all food. The American chestnut is extinct. There is a hybrid, and I think the American Chestnut Society, I know they have information. They got it down to like 1/14 or 1/16 or something. But the American chestnut was killed in the 1800s by a blight. But at one time, it was a very important food source for the Lenape people, just as important as corn. Mm-hmm.
Do you know if the horseshoe chestnut is edible?
It's chestnut. It's not edible.
I don't. Yeah, okay. And I don't know every nut or every plant, but I don't believe so.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What was the tree your folks cut down?
It was a maple.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was a maple.
Say something about the black walnut.
Yeah, please.
Garden around it.
What?
No gardens will ever grow because I think it sucks too much nitrogen.
The tannins that come out of that.
Every garden feels.
Yeah.
In nature around it. So that's the only thing I'll say.
So there is a reason, maybe, if you food, black walnut. Yeah, definitely. Thank you though for sharing. And so trees were important. They were a great food source, and it's also how they made their shelters, their houses. So people think Native Americans and they think teepees. We were doing this play for our church one time, and my daughter was involved because she's involved in theater, and the Boy Scout troop was involved because they needed service hours, and everybody kept talking about putting up a teepee. And I finally said, if you want to use my stuff from Waterloo, we are not putting up a teepee. We're going to represent authentically and accurately. My family is very mixed background. I have Swedish, Norwegian, Italian, and Irish. And there's a very big difference between a Christmas Eve meal from the Swedish family and the Italian family. A very big difference. And the cultural differences don't end there. Are they all from Europe? Yeah. Can we call them Europeans? Yes. But they're very different, right? So Native Americans are all very different. The Lenape built their houses out of saplings and tree bark, reed mats. They were not teepees because teepees are made out of buffalo hide, and buffalo need Great Plains for millions of buffalo, and those people were able to use the resources available to them, the buffalo, for everything, right? They used the stomach as a bag for water. They weren't using squash as a water jug. They were using a buffalo stomach. They were burning buffalo waste. So it's the resources that are available. That's what the people used. And for the Lenape, they built these little wigwams. They extended their wigwams into longhouses, right? Too many kids, put on an addition. We still do that now. And that's where they lived. So saplings, so brilliant, because I told you cutting down a really big tree was difficult, right? They had stone tools. Sapling, a lot easier to cut down. They're flexible, they bend, so they were used for the frame, and then the bark was taken off older, more mature trees, layered all the way up on the outside. On the inside, there were beautiful grass mats. They acted sort of like an insulator. Also, they acted as a humidity regulator. And these were comfortable places. Fires were kept burning in the colder months on the inside. There were smoke holes in the roof. And this is where the people lived. They slept on things like bear hides and deer hide, and the fur kept them warm. And this is one that we're not quite that great at it yet, but we're trying. So this is just one that we put up every spring because every winter our Lenape village seems to just come down with the snowfall. But so every spring we're pretty much rebuilding them, and we just like to show, you know, the process. There's a frame and there's layers of bark, and and then were there temporary shelters and shade shelters and things like that? Absolutely. You know, lean-tos and areas just for working outside to get out of the sun. All right, cordage, so important for so many of the things that we've talked about already. So cordage is pretty much your essential survival tool as well, right? You have to have rope. You have to have something, and there are trees, there are plants. So I have some examples up here. The dogbane and milkweed are plants, and inside the stem of those plants are real stringy fibers that can be rolled together and then twisted together into cordage. When you're talking about a tree, what you're really looking at is inside the bark. The inner layer of the bark can be stripped, and that's a stringy fiber. Also, there are things for cordage like sinew, which is inside a deer's leg, holding the tendons to the bone. And I even once, or maybe more than once, read about the Lenape people using the skin from the neck of a snapping turtle to make a very strong cord. So a snapping turtle, an older snapping turtle, very thick, very tough skin. Of course, they ate turtles. Used their shells again for all sorts of things, right? Bowls and platters, rattles. Turtle shells were very useful. But, you know, to kind of spiral cut that skin into a long strip, it was apparently a very strong leather strap. Okay. So hunting, essential, all kinds of ways to hunt animals for the Lenape people. We know bow and arrow, like we automatically kind of think of that, right, when we think of Native Americans, but they were using a lot of traps. They were using snare traps and deadfalls, lots of different ways that they were catching the animals. Now turkey, so important. You know, I just have to show this because it's so beautiful. I'm just going to squeeze right through here. So I only have one other friend who receives dead animals as a gift. People will bring me animals that have already died or expired because they know that I will use the parts in the Lenape village. So they'll, you know, if they find a dead turtle or something. And there's only one other woman that I've ever met in my life. And she lives in Indiana now. And the name of her programs are Woodland Indian Education Programs. And she is so skilled in the arts. And she actually recreated this turkey feather cape. So this would be a ceremonial garment or a special garment that the women would make. And first, they had to spend all of that time making the actual net. And then weaving each individual feather into it. So this is something that would be worn, you know, for a special occasion, a wedding or some sort of special occasion. And it's just so beautiful, so I like to show it. And I hope no one's allergic to feathers, because it does shed a little bit. But these are the things that I don't put out for the 2,000 school kids that come through every week. It wouldn't last a day. I use my older furs and feathers and snake skins for that. And by the way, there's a snake skin up here too. Again, which this wouldn't last very long with a class of second graders, right? But did you know you can laminate a snake skin? You can. You can run it right through a plastic laminator. Child-proof. All right, so turkey feathers, not only did they eat the meat, but the feathers were beautiful and made into capes. Let me just see. I just want to see how we're doing on time so I know how far.
7:50.
50?
50, yes.
Okay, great. So the woodland animals obviously were all throughout this area, and each one of them had a different use for the Lenape people. I talked a little bit about the turkey and the bear. After the presentation, I do have some real bear claws up here and teeth. I talked a little bit about the parts of the deer, the sinew, the antlers for tools, beaver. They ate beavers, but also the beaver fur trade became a very interesting thing that happened early on in the contact between Europeans and the Lenape people. So, and some birds that you may not know about or think about very often are the passenger pigeon. Anybody ever hear about the passenger pigeons? Yeah.
Millions of them.
Millions of them. Reportedly darkening the skies for hours as flocks flew overhead. and they were wiped out. Yeah. They were an easy catch, and they were eaten to extinction. Quickly. Okay, so I'm going to skip over that one and talk to you a little bit about pottery. So broken pottery shards are another commonly found artifact, and you can learn a lot from pottery. Now, the clay, of course, is going to come from the river. They would add measured amounts of sand and broken shell to temper the clay, and they would, coil wrap pots. This was something that the women would do mostly, and the different shapes of the pots changed throughout time. But what I think is so interesting is the designs. So they would use corded paddles and rub that, back and forth into the clay. They would create faces and designs on the pots, but you could learn a lot about the people by how the pots were decorated. For example, if the pots were sort of utilitarian looking in a certain area for a certain period of time, you would say, well, there wasn't a whole lot of free time here, okay? They're making a pot, and they're making it so that hands don't slip. Maybe they're pressing, they're doing some imprints in it, but that was about it. When they were more intricately decorated, then you can assume they had more free time. Then you look at the decorations that matched with other groups around them. So they would assimilate with groups that they either traded with or were living near, and they would borrow and share techniques and decorations. And so there's a lot you can learn from pottery, just from those little broken pieces that are found. I just think it's very interesting. We have a hands-on pottery program that we do as well.
These weren't fired, they were just coiled and fired.
No, they were fired, but they were fired in the ground, basically, left out to dry. And then they fired them in the ground. We tried it. They all broke. So
what are the dimensions of them?
All different. Yes, all different. Small pots, large pots. The New Jersey State Museum in Trenton has a really great pottery section in where their exhibit's called New Jersey's Original People, and they have a fantastic pottery section there. Inside our longhouses, we have some different museum display exhibits for helping us tell the story of how the people lived. And this one is where we just talk about how really storytelling was an important part of the culture, passing down information. They did not have a written language, and storytelling was something that was also entertaining. As I'm sure you can imagine, there were people that could be very good storytellers, right? And if you're a good storyteller, maybe that would become your job. And so you would travel from one village to another, and all of the things that married couples, for example, would be assisting each other with doing and making, with the hunting and the clothing and the gardening and food and all those necessities. You wouldn't really be worried about that, because as you arrived at each village, they were so excited to have a good storyteller that you would receive gifts. So you would receive clothing, you would receive food, and you made your living telling stories if you were real good at it. And one of the rite of passage for a young man was, of course, seeking a vision quest and going out into the woods at about anywhere between 12 to 14 years old, and basically removing yourself from your village and, spending an amount of time without food, without water, in thoughtful prayer to the Great Spirit that they believed in, hoping that you would receive some sort of vision, some sort of guardian spirit, that you could then take that story and go back, and you would have this guardian spirit that you would carry with you. And if you weren't quite ready to go out, but your parents thought you were, they'd sort of start to shove you out by not being very nice to you. And it was something that all boys did. Now, not all girls would go and seek a vision, but sometimes one came to them anyway. And a common thing would be for a girl to decide that she was going to be a healer. Whether it was a walk in the woods, something spoke to her, something told her that she was going to be a healer. And so being a Nent Pike or an herbal healer, you had to know all of the different plants, so many different uses for the plants. And it wasn't just the physical properties of the plants or the chemical properties and the physical application. It was also an entire spiritual world, something that, you know, we don't teach where I work because we can't even begin to understand it. Never mind try to make someone else understand it, right? But the spiritual world was just as important as the physical world. And so what side of the tree you took the bark from, for example, the east side was more important because the morning sun had more energy. And these things were very real. They were very real parts of the recipe for the medicines, and they worked. Lots of them worked. And some, you know, we have borrowed. Modern society, we have borrowed some of the medicines that go way back to the Native American times. People still use plants for medicine today. Some that are interesting, willow bark has salicylic acid, the same as an aspirin. Tobacco leaves, you can chew those and put them on a bee sting. People still do that. Wild strawberries, delicious to eat, but you can also put them on your face for your complexion. Same with stump water. So tannins leaching out of the stump into the water, good for things like acne. And it's amazing how many natural remedies there are. So something like poison sumac can be cured with a tea made out of the inner bark of the sour gum tree. So many different. Jewelweed, you can rub jewelweed all over poison ivy, and that will work.
Artemisia too.
What?
Artemisia.
Artemisium?
Mugwort.
Mugwort, yes, mugwort too. Yeah.
Bee stings when doing gardening, I just rub
Yes.
it. Totally heals it.
And mugwort, right? So funny story, just a little sidetrack. So I was away for a couple weeks recently, and when I got back, I said, who pulled out all my mugwort? And my mom was starting to get embarrassed by the amount of weeds I had in my yard. So while I was away for a few weeks, she pulled out all my mugwort. A weed is only something that you don't want growing in your yard, right? What makes it a weed? Mugwort is helpful, medicinal, right?
It also alleviates menstrual cramps.
Yes, there's so many different things. Different kinds of pine, sycamore bark tea, poison ivy. These are easy ones. These are easy to identify. White pine is the one with 5 needles growing out of each cluster. You can put a bunch of those in hot water for a sore throat. Pitch pine is something that was used for basically sort of like a glue. Also, it's flammable. I'm going to skip over that. Just go into plants that were used as dye and for creating different paints and colors. And I just want to look ahead at 2 of the, okay, so these are my last 3 slides. So I just don't want to go too far over because I want to make sure we have time for questions. So another thing, another exhibit that we have, but we, as Charles said in the beginning, I'm responsible for the development of the education programs, right? So we don't teach about the spiritual beliefs, as important as it was to the people. I don't feel that we can do it justice. But we do have these exhibits that were there even before I started. So burial practices, the Lenape people did bury in the ground. Some Native groups elevated on, the word is escaping me, or yeah, platforms, or used pyres and burning, and they were burying in the ground. They did believe in spirits. This is The Mising was a spirit of the forest, and they would have a ceremony that lasted 12 days every year. I believe it was in the fall, and it was basically thanking the Mising for everything. If you think about all the things we've talked about, they all came from the forest, right? Shelter building supplies, food, clothing supplies from animal skins, everything comes from the forest. So the spirit from the forest was very important. So they did have a very special ceremony, lasted 12 days in honor of the Mising. And this is my last slide. This is our language section where we play a game. I just kind of like the language. I'm probably not the best pronunciator, but there really was no word for goodbye. I taught you thank you, which was wanishi. But there really was no goodbye. They like to say, you know, I'll see you again soon. So since this is my last slide, I'll say lapichkinawe, which is I hope to see you again soon, or I'll see you again soon. But I'm not leaving. So if anyone has any questions, I'm here.